In this video, I'll be offering my thoughts on the TTArtisan's Autofocus 27mm f2.8 lens for Fujifilm X. Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'll be taking you through my thoughts on the 27mm f2.8 autofocus lens from the TTArtisan. It's a tiny little lens that looks very reminiscent of Fujifilm's own 27mm f2.8 offerings, on the surface at least, but it's a little larger. Now, on the inside, however, it is quite a different beast. So let's dig into it and figure out exactly who this lens might be for. Now, before we get started though, TTArtisan did provide this lens for testing. I do get to keep it, but they don't have any input on this review and they don't get to see it before it goes live. All the thoughts here, good and bad, have been formed over the last sort of month and a half or so that I've been using the lens. So without further ado, let's get into it. Overall, this lens feels quite good in the hand, and much better than I would have expected for a lens at this price point, especially an autofocus lens. Now, the body is machined from some very smooth-feeling, lightweight materials, and it weighs just 93 grams, which is so close to Fujifilm's own 27mm lens that the difference really isn't even noticeable. Now, I mention this because it's such a big step forward for TTArtisan, who've basically been making these really heavy metal and glass manual focus lenses to date. Now, this lens is a lot more modern in its design and material choices, but of course at this price point you're not going to see weather-resistant seals and things like that. The aperture ring has two knurled tabs that make it easy to turn, and it's click to 1/3 stops from f2.8 through to f16. Now, on balance, I actually prefer Fujifilm's sort of fully knurled ring design, but this definitely gets the job done, and that's just a personal preference. Now, TTArtisan also includes a small lens hood to help with flare and protect the front element, and we'll get into flare a little bit later in the review, but let's just say that the hood may as well be purely cosmetic. And finally, when it comes to build quality, there is the included lens cap. Now, normally I would berate a third-party manufacturer for their poor lens cap quality or, making it difficult to fit to other Fujifilm lenses, but this one has a trick up its sleeve. Now, the cap itself has a USB-C port and contacts to update the firmware of the lens. Now, this solves a common issue that I have with a lot of third-party lenses in a simple way. Now, some manufacturers would, charge for a similar tool, make it an expensive accessory, and some would include the USB-C port on the mount itself, but TTArtisan have made the decision to include this cap as part of the initial purchase, which is really great, to be honest, so well done on that one. Autofocus in this lens is driven by a stepping motor, so we should expect it to be swifter and quieter than Fujifilm's XF27mm, and that definitely holds true. The lens is inaudible and it just zips into place without too much hunting. At times I've noticed that it will sort of hesitate before it begins to focus, as though it's sort of deep in thought or contemplation, and then it will just sort of zip immediately into place. If we take a look at the Fujifilm XF lens with its DC cordless motor and the TTArtisan with its stepping motor, we can easily see where the advantages of a stepping motor lie. So Fujifilm, I really do hope, again, that you're paying attention to this mounting competition. So far in my day-to-day use, I've found the focusing to be mostly accurate, but I have noticed from time to time that it just seems to miss randomly. Now, I'm assuming that this will be improved in some upcoming firmware updates, but overall though, I would say that maybe 95% or more of the images that I've shot have been perfectly in focus. Now honestly, as a first effort on the Fujifilm X system, this is a fairly impressive feat by TTArtisan, so really no complaints to be had, and I hope that it gets improved through firmware updates. At f2.8, we definitely see some softness all the way across the image. It's definitely usable, but it's not what I would call a great level of detail rendering. As we stop down, the center of the frame gets much better, and by f5.6 and f8, detail is good, but not great. f11 and f16 are a little soft from diffraction again, and sort of begin to reverse course in terms of detail rendering. Now, when it comes to the corner, they're much like the center. From f2.8, they're a little soft, although not that much different from the center, and this trend sort of continues through the aperture range, with the corners basically on par with the center of the frame, all the way through the aperture range. Overall, if you're not planning to shoot wide open or pixel peeping, this lens will deliver a reasonably detailed image, and for anything where you're in need of really fine detail, I would definitely look to another lens to produce those images. Chroma is present in the images that we get from this lens, and as we can see, wide open pin lights begin to sort of splay and smear a little bit, and by f5.6 they clean up quite a lot, and pin lights render as they should. Now, this is something to be aware of if you're hoping to get detailed cityscapes at night. I was hard-pressed to find any purple and green fringing at all with this lens, even in the most demanding of situations. And here with this backlit image of all the reflective surfaces on a bicycle, I was still only able to produce a hint of fringing, which is great to see in a tiny little lens at this price point. This lens produces a vignette. That's really all we need to know. It doesn't really ever go away. At f2.8, it darkens the frame all the way across, with the extreme corners being more than 3 stops darker than the center. And this can even sometimes result in, undesirable effects on your meter reading if you're working in a mode like aperture priority, as the center of the frame can blow out due to the dark corners sort of tricking the meter a little bit. And by f4, we see the viewfinder get significantly brighter and more evenly lit. But even at f8, the vignette is still there and visible in the viewfinder. In post-production, the main darkening of the image can be fairly easily corrected for, especially at smaller aperture values, but the corners, especially when working at f2.8, are very difficult to correct for. Now, this vignette can be used for creative effect at times, but for the vast majority of the time, it's something that you're going to need to be aware of and compensate for in your exposures. Now, bokeh with an f2.8 lens of this focal length is not something we're going to be concerned about with a lot of the shooting that we're going to do with it, especially considering that the lens really isn't that sharp wide open. But shallow depth of field is absolutely possible with this lens, so let's take a look at the results. Firstly, bokeh balls. At f2.8, the center of the image produces nice round circles and the corners have a very significant cat's eye effect. Now, if we look closely at these, we can also notice a little bit of an outline around them that might be undesirable for some photographers. Now, as we begin to stop down, the aperture blades take over the shape of that bokeh, and very quickly we end up with very different looking out of focus areas that may or may not be desirable for some images. And when it comes to blurred foliage, we see quite harsh edges and a fairly jittery appearance. Now, personally, this is not the sort of bokeh that I want in my images, as it tends to draw your attention away from the subject. So I would avoid shooting shallow depth of field images with this lens. I promised earlier in this review that I would talk about flare, and put simply, it's significant. In fact, the first time that I saw it, I laughed out loud in the street. With the sun just outside of the frame, we lose a good amount of contrast in the image, and huge ghosts start to appear across the frame. But without further ado, let's take a look from f2.8 through to f8. Of course, slightly changing your angle or completely shading the lens prevents this flare and ghosting immediately, but it's something that you'll need to be constantly aware of. And when used deliberately, I'm sure it could be interesting in some cases, but it could just as easily ruin a perfectly usable image, so definitely watch out for it. Sunstars begin to appear at f4, but by f5.6 they're large and beginning to take very clear shape. Now, by f11 they're very well defined, so if you're into large sunstars, they're definitely possible here. And the 7 aperture blades provide for a 14% star as well, so definitely watch out when there are a lot of lights in the frame, because it can get very busy very quickly. Much like Fujifilm's X f27mm lenses, this is a fun little lens that basically makes for a very small package on just about any Fujifilm body except the X-H series. Now, it's not quite as tiny and discreet as the XF lenses, but it's still plenty small enough to call it a pancake lens. I found it to be a good companion when cycling long distances because of its negligible weight and its decent image quality. It's great for just sort of making records of the places that I cycle and the things that I see. The combination of the X-T5 and the 27mm is basically the same weight as a couple of snacks that I might take with me anyway, so it's a great companion in that regard. It's also been a really good street lens, which I can imagine is what a lot of people who buy this lens are going to use it for. Now, it's a good middle ground between the 23 and the 33mm focal lengths, giving a little bit more of a wide field of view in tighter scenes and a little bit of extra perspective distortion over the 33mm. Now, autofocus is fast enough to keep up with, both the photographer and a subject moving in the street, and I haven't really had any issues with its speed. For my client work though, the vignette, the relatively slow aperture of f2.8 and the overall image quality, especially when compared to lenses like the XF23 and 33mm that I typically use for my client work, make this a bit of a non-starter. Now, with the XF23 and 33mm, I can predict that they're going to create great image quality every single time. With this lens, I can't use it wide open. It's a little bit soft. I don't really know how it's going to behave around certain light sources. So for me, it really can't be used to deliver predictable results to my clients. At a retail price of around $150, or roughly the same cost as a spare battery and a couple of cheap memory cards, this lens is an absolute no-brainer if you want an excuse to get into the 27mm focal length. Now, it's not quite as high quality as the Fujifilm XF offerings, or as unique as the Viltrox 27mm, both of which we'll get into in an upcoming video, but if you're on a budget, you really can't go wrong with this lens. Now, some things to be aware of are the flare, ghosting, and the very significant vignette, but otherwise, image quality is really good considering the price point and size of the lens, and it makes for a great walk-around lens for, street photography and that sort of thing. But it's definitely not one that's going to make it into my bag when I'm out on a client shoot being paid to create high-quality images time after time. So for those who aren't pixel peeping or, demanding the very best, this is definitely a good alternative to the XF27mm f2.8 in my opinion. Now, the XF lens has slightly better image quality, especially in terms of the vignette and the flare characteristics, and it's quite a bit sharper. But if those things aren't that important to you, I would say you'll be very, very happy with the TTArtisan lens. So as always, thank you for watching, and if you haven't already given this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, all that sort of good stuff, I would really appreciate your support in that way, if you found this video useful in any way. And also do let me know if you have any additional questions about this lens in the comments below. I will do my best to answer those for you. And finally, enjoy the slideshow, and I'll see you in the next video.